Okay, everybody, welcome back in this second lecture of this week. I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of sociological frames. I find that sometimes when we think about emerging adulthood and we think about adults, sometimes there's just some weird vibes between what we sometimes call generational tension, right? Sometimes it's like, I don't know, Gen X fighting with Millennial, Millennial fighting with Gen Z, Gen Z wondering about Gen Alpha, blah, blah, blah. But I actually think there's other theories and ideas and looks and frames that we can actually think about with why there's sort of this tension between younger and older generations and how it affects emerging adults in particular. So let me just try to unpack that with you for a little bit here, and let's just muse on this a little bit more. And maybe it helps us appreciate the complexity and also maybe gives us some new looks for us to think about as you think about your particular context. So one of the first things I want to talk about is this concept called social domain theory. Social domain theory highlights that conflict is about young people striving to create their own personal identity within their social context. Okay, so you have young people that are trying to find their way in a world that they've grown up in. Society has handed something to them, but at the same time, they're trying to find their own sense of identity. And so what happens is in social domain theory is as they assert one's personal identity, and they think about especially their identity exploration, there is sometimes incongruence within cultures that stems from incongruence that are found in individuals. Sometimes we feel something in the air because there's something that individuals are wrestling with. There's conflict, there's hierarchy, there's particular social domains of which people enter and leave and engage that create harmony and also create a sense of dissonance. And so what can happen sometimes is that there can be conflict between young people and adults. Oftentimes occurs between a young person's personal domain versus an adult's appeal for a social convention. So the way this works is like this. When there is conflict between an older person and a younger person, oftentimes most seen between parent and child, oftentimes parents will appeal to tradition. This is the way we've always done it. What do you mean you don't want to do that? We've always done it this way. You know it's the right thing to do. We have to do this because, I've told you so, or people are expecting it. Whatever the language might be, oftentimes when there's conflicts, parents appeal to tradition or sort of this larger sense of social convention. Young people in those conflicts appeal to their agency. But I want to do this. But I am old enough. What do you mean I can't do that? Who's to say? Isn't it my right? Aren't I smart enough? You've trusted me here. Why can't you trust me with that? You see what happens? There's this sense to agency. So sometimes what social domain theory talks about is that when there's conflict, you have one group, typically the older ones, appealing to social convention, and the younger ones, typically the younger group, appealing to the sense of agency. And so what social domain theory does then, it highlights the conflict about young people striving to create their own personal identity within their social context. Okay. And I think this is really important because I think this is true for individualistic cultures and communal cultures. That even though there might be an impulse toward one's individualism or one's sense of interdependence, there's still the sense of me trying to make my space and understand who I am in relationship to myself, to my relationships, and to my world. I'm trying to understand who I am. What is unique about me within the context in the system that I am a part of? How do I operate as a son or as a nephew or as a mentor or as a father or a mother or whatever it might be? So this tension and this negotiating is happening all the time. And you can imagine when you think about emerging adulthood for a second, how this has an effect. If in my 20s, there is ambiguity as to what it means to grow up, there is going to be ambiguity then in the way one relates to one's parents or one's community, which begins to then have people appealing to social convention or personal agency, and you begin to see what happens there. So I think this is a really important theory, just to sort of consider where the tension comes from. It isn't because people are good or bad. It's simply because they're trying to work things out together, and they're both appealing to something associated with that. Also, when we think about this idea of emerging adulthood, I think that there's something really interesting for us to consider when it comes to the way like societies work together. And this is where some researchers talk about this idea of dependency, a dependency ratio. Now, a dependency ratio works like this. This is the formula, okay? Um, it's the population age 0 to 14 plus the population age 65 and older um, compared to the population of those ages 15 to 64. So another way to think about it is this, is that the populations described at the top of this equation, they're the ones that are often dependent upon the populations on the bottom of this equation, because the population in the bottom of this equation is really, it's the working force. It's the people that are generating goods and services, and oftentimes are the ones that are paying taxes because of the income generated to live and to keep society going. Those that are under 14 and over 65 are ones that are dependent upon the rest of society. They're oftentimes not working. They are the ones that can't work yet, or they've retired, or whatever it might be, and so they are not contributing to society in the same sort of way. Now, when you think about this for a second, think about it this way: if the populations on the top of this equation get larger, and the population in the bottom equation gets smaller, what happens to the number? The number gets bigger. So when the number gets bigger, that means that there are more people that are supported and less people to support them. And then the inverse is there as well, right? So what we're seeing, and you've probably seen this in other, popular articles or something in the news, what we're seeing is that people are living longer, and we have a much more successful or less infant mortality rate. So in many ways, there are more dependent people around. That is creating much more pressure on society for a group of people that supposedly are supposed to be contributing to society that maybe aren't always doing so, especially in emerging adulthood. If we think about this idea that if people are taking longer to grow up, to achieve their success, or to step into the fields that they want to do, if that's happening later in life, the amount of what they can produce via taxes or otherwise is going to be less, simply because they're not entering the workforce in the same sort of way maybe a generation did ago. So this creates some problems, and it just begins to show that things are changing. So here's the example: if the numbers change from 0 to 14. To 0 to 30, and they change from 15 to 30, we're finding a larger population that is dependent and a smaller population that is supportive. And so we see this across the board. When we look at the world, we look at the fact that, remember, like the larger the number gets, the more there are people that are dependent on people, and less there are people who can actually provide the support. So if we look at just the world population, we see that the world is getting older, and by 2050, the number is going to be significantly larger than it is in 2010. Now we can also look at other countries along the way. Now, India seems to be reversing that trend, but look at China, look at South Korea, look at Japan, look at the United States, look at Western Europe. We have an aging population that depends more on those that are working, but we have a shrinking population of those that can support that. This has a tremendous effect on the way societies work and the pressures that we feel. Some researchers would say that this challenge of growing growing elderly and dependency ratios is something to really pay attention to economically. We have an increased retired population that puts greater burden on the working population. The elderly also have unprecedented economic, demographic, and political influence. And maybe we feel that a little bit especially in the United States today, as we come into another election, where we recognize the fact that an aging population has tremendous power in the ways that they are thinking about policy, the way they're thinking about where the country should go, compared to a younger generation that perhaps has some different views on that. So public policy has to sort of navigate the potential power struggle between public resources, as we've got an old generation that are going to be like, I don't want to build schools. Um, I don't want to pay more taxes. I don't want to do those things. There are some challenges associated with that I think are really, really crucial. And again, this goes beyond this particular class. This is not about it's not about economics, but I do think we just need to recognize the fact that this idea of emerging adulthood isn't like this cute little thing that we're trying to figure out to do ministry better, though that is something that is really important. It actually has this ripple effect on the way society works. Now, when it comes to gender, I think that's also something really, really crucial to think about. And, you know, are women or men better off today than they were a generation ago? I mean, those are really important questions, and it probably varies by men and women as we think about this. And I have a number of articles that are either in the required or the recommended reading that I've given to you for regarding this. But I do think this idea, especially for women feeling in between, is really, really crucial. Uh, Females are pulled in multiple directions as they, in many ways, have to deal with the possibility of an excitement of new opportunities available to them, especially now with the, you know, thinking about emerging adulthood, and at the same time recognizing the fact that oftentimes these opportunities are additive. It's not or, it's and. And so more is expected of them to be fantastic in everything. Where oftentimes I think when you think about being a man, that those expectations haven't really changed as much. I mean, in some ways they have, but not as dramatically as I think women have. And so I just think there's some unique and specific challenges to women and emerging adulthood that are worth considering as well. And perhaps as you're thinking about this class and you're thinking about like what really moves you or challenges you or what you want to lean into a little bit more, I think studying women and in emerging adulthood is actually a phenomenal exploration for you to consider. And I want you to keep that in mind as well. I think also when we think about this idea of multicultural identities, I think we just need to recognize the fact that with this comes this new sense that we have to have of awareness, of the salience of it, of the searching that goes on, the fluidity and negotiation that's happening as we think about this idea of intersectionality and all the other work that comes with identity development along the way. I find what's interesting is we look at this globally, and there's just been a lot more research that's beginning to pop up with regards to emerging adulthood in other parts of the country. It gets back to what we talked about before, that this idea of what emerging adulthood looks like expresses itself in different ways in different parts of the world. So as this particular article talks about, emerging adulthood may describe the privilege of Latin American men. And this is worth sort of thinking about, that emerging adulthood really is a space of privilege, especially for men in a Latin American context. At the same time, emerging adulthood may describe the liberation for Japanese single women who historically have not really had this sense of being their own persons. They've always been connected to sort of a male figurehead within their lives, whether it's the father or the spouse that they eventually married. And so this emerging adulthood space where there are more single Japanese women that are stepping into what they sense are their purpose in lives and their careers are actually finding that they have to carve a whole new space within society for them. And so there's something deeply liberating about this concept of emerging adulthood for them. Emerging adulthood also may describe systemic support and permission for emerging young people to European young people to explore. So this is really interesting to think about it as well. In an individualistic society, especially when we think about it politically and otherwise, in the United States, you're sort of asked to kind of find your way and do your thing, and that's sort of celebrated. and even public policy would probably reinforce that in some ways. When you look at some of the, especially Western European countries, where the social system is such that the support net is much more developed and much more robust, there's actually room for emerging adults to find their way simply because society and policy is set up to support them in that way. So emerging adulthood, again, has a different sense or a different feel, perhaps from in Western Europe compared to even the United States. And also, I think emerging adulthood can describe compromise between generations. This idea of emerging adulthood has an impact not just on emerging adults, but the way that a culture thinks about the relationship with the elders, the ways that they think about family systems, or the ways that they think about interaction, and it impacts those things as well. And so we're finding that the emerging adulthood has many different expressions, and it shows up in different ways that are arising new and really interesting conversations. Neblett and Roth and Siad and Blake also talk about emerging adulthood in this way. They say emerging adults provide a window into understanding contextual fluidity in different dimensions of race and ethnicity for all age groups because of their heightened experience, providing a bridge between racial identity research on adolescents and adults. So there's something unique about this space of emerging adulthood. Where the attention and focus is high on thinking about one's identity and one's personhood and one's relationship to family and family systems and society, that I think are really, really crucial in the ways that we think about where emerging adulthood is going and how it affects all the different relationships that we are a part of. So just some things for you to think about as we reflect on this particular lecture. What factors, culture, race, ethnicity, gender, orientation, family systems, have impacted who I am and where I'm heading? How might these factors help me see the diversity and complexity of the emerging adults I relate to? And how might these factors bring added hope and challenge to emerging adults trying to negotiate their lives? There's a lot to think about here. There's a lot of different topics and forces and theories at play. But if we become more aware of them, I think it helps us to be more sophisticated and more compassionate toward the emerging adults in our spheres. And perhaps we are the ones that can open up the possibility to enter into conversation with emerging adults in new ways, where they can feel seen, where they can feel understood, and where they can feel supported. I hope that helps. Thanks. Peace.